across this diagonal line. And essentially what you're doing is you're just taking the ratio of the star formation in the most recent bin versus the ratio of star formation over the next bin, and essentially we can get into it later, but because these purple, the very extreme galaxies tend to lie on this side, it essentially means that they're really going through likely their first burst. So Jonathan coined this, which I thought was great. It's what we call them as first burst galaxies, simply because they're so extreme. Their specific star formation rates are high, on the order of 5 or so per gig year, compared to say the blue galaxies, which is more on the order of like 1.5 to 2 on average. All right, so in the next bit, let me just that's what we were able to do just with the imaging alone. Now what would be great is that we can actually go and do some spectroscopy. So that's what MOSEL is, near-infrared spectroscopy of galaxies, the interesting objects that are identified from ZFOURGE. And so here, once again, I told you by halfway through the talk, everyone would know what this is. So those 3 lines, H beta, 03, 49, 59, and 5007. So these are spectra now that we've been able, these are actually Keck spectra. We also have recently got some data from the BLT. And these are essentially the 2D spectra for our galaxies for which we've observed in increasing redshift. And so you'll see here that line and those 2 lines. And so we call it Multi-Object Spectroscopic Emission Line Survey, or MOSEL, because we all love acronyms. And if it sounds familiar, it's because it's a winemaking region in Germany as well. So, in terms of those spectra, once again, that trio of lines that I flagged early in the talk, you can see them as at low redshift. This is around redshift 3, and then up here, up to about redshift 3.8 or so, it gets very ratty, of course, because it's hard. Near-infrared spectroscopy is hard. I always, especially for younger people, I'm like, you have no idea. Like, even being able to do this 20 years ago wasn't even on the, I mean, I'm sure it was on the radar for many people, certainly the people building the instruments, but for somebody who worked in optical spectroscopy and dealt with skylines and yeah, it was bad. So being able to do something like this is really, really extraordinary. So in terms of where we are with them, so here is a histogram on the x-axis of the K-band magnitudes of the objects for which we're able to get redshifts. Essentially, there's the ZFOURGE, so the targets versus the red circles, which are the ones for which we were able to get spectra. Really, all you need to notice is that for the objects for which we are able to get a redshift, the ZFOURGE versus the ZFOURGE versus the Z-spec is fairly on the mark, which is good. Even down to these magnitudes here, which is very faint. And I just want to focus on this range here, in particular 3 to 3.8.
A short question. Does that accuracy change with the spectral type that you have?
So we noticed,
sometimes
so we noticed that for the Lyman break galaxies, which the accuracy was around on the order of 1.8 to 2%, but then if you went to the very extreme emission line galaxies, it would drop down to 1.3 to 1.5%. So interestingly enough, the really strong emission line galaxies, the ZFOURGEs and the Z-specs were, the uncertainties were less. For our relatively small subsample of about 35, 40 objects. There's a more extensive analysis of how accurate the ZFOURGes and Z-specs are in Carolina's paper, 2016, as well as Adam's 2016 paper, where they actually compare the Z-specs and ZFOURGes for across the full wavelength range from like everything that was in the literature in those legacy fields, which of course are thousands of objects. Here, I was just really focused on this redshift range. And so just as a highlight from this paper, which I just resubmitted the referee report yesterday, so hopefully it'll be accepted soon. Here I'm showing essentially what's known as a star-forming main sequence. Terrible name. Totally own up to that. Because to me, as I remember Charlie giving a talk, the main sequence is what I think of as an HR diagram. It's very tight, well-defined, relatively well understood. This is a scatter plot. But it's a scatter plot that sort of hovers around certain lines, and these lines that we draw. So here we have stellar mass, this range, and then star formation rate on the x-axis. The solid line is what is that star forming main sequence as determined by Adam Tomchek et al. In 2016, our group from the full ZFOURGE sample. I just wanted to focus on the galaxies here between redshift 3 and 4, and so that's why there aren't a bunch of galaxies around here, otherwise it just becomes like a crazy plot. I think the one thing that I want you to take away from this is all of the emission line galaxies that we were focusing on here, which are the stars, so there are these stars here, and these are spectroscopically confirmed, they all lie above this solid line. And so these are their mass doubling times. These are just lines of mass doubling times, if you want to think of it that way, or specific star formation rate. So these are objects that have very extreme emission, and they all tend to lie above the star forming main sequence. This is also consistent with work by Mike Maseda from 3D HST. I'm sure Eric is well familiar with this work, where he also shows that their strong emission line galaxies lie above the star forming main sequence, well above at redshift 2, because of course at redshift 2, this actually drops down a bit. Now, for the remainder of my talk, I really want to focus on work that my postdoc Anshu has been doing with the data, the spectroscopy that we've been able to obtain. And so I'm just going to keep showing you spectra, different versions of spectra. So this is the 1D spectra for one of our galaxies. Those are those emission lines there. So now I've just changed the color contrast. She did, not me. I like black and white. She likes red. So here we have the color contrast, and so those are your emission line objects, emission lines, and corresponding to H beta and O3. And then when you now have spectra, you can do fun things like measure kinematics. And so in this case, from this line, which is by far the strongest of the lines that we've been able to measure, you can derive the rotation velocities and the velocity dispersions. Because it's 2D, right, so you can trace those rotation curves, which is, once again, awesome and not something I could have imagined.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
A simple question. Earlier you also showed us how the flux change with the age of a star. So I wanted to know how do you connect this map to H beta or to emission? I mean, younger stars, how they behave, and older stars.
So all we can do is measure the emission. I mean, and the emission is we're assuming is actually not coming from the stars. It's actually from the gas that the stars ionize. So that's, does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I feel like that you told me the peak comes from stars, right? That I was asking.
The peak in the emission, I mean, that peak that I showed you with the SED, yeah, so those are the blended H beta and O3 lines, and those lines are driven by the flux around of gas around the stars. So the thing is, when we look at galaxies, at least, well, let's just, for now, we can talk about IFUs later. When we look at galaxies, we really just look at the integrated light. So we look at all of light, from everything, it's all mixed up together. So we could try to separate, say, the bulge from the disk, but I wouldn't do it, not this redshift. So we really just are measuring, it's like just a big light bucket, so all the light from the galaxy, stars, all gas, everything. So we can't really separate that. But we do know that, for the most part, old stars can't ionize hydrogen regions, so they can't make those strong emission lines. You really need the very young stars, very massive stars that can generate the ionizing flux that you need to.
So you already know they must be young. That was kind of.
They must be what? Yes, yeah. Sure. So, modulo contribution from AGN, from active black nuclei, but we removed them. So AGN can also, of course, excite the gas and cause strong emission lines, and we do have a couple of cases of those, but they have also a different signature in terms of the line ratios. So we've been able to remove those from the sample, at least as much as one can. So with the 2D and 1D spectra, we can now go and actually measure kinematics. All right, so here we have stellar mass again on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have sigma, which is essentially, it's really just the integrated velocities version. And the gold points are the same in both panels. So those are our galaxies at redshift 3, and now I've expanded the galaxies, not just the extreme galaxies, it's just everything we can get between redshift 3 and 4. So that includes just regular old Lyman break galaxies, as well as the very strong initial line galaxies. So the gold stars in both panels are the same. So this panel on the left-hand side is a comparison to another another survey, Gesine type, that's at redshift 3. And I'd like to just point out that for the most part, if you're like, well, they don't look any different, that's exactly what you're supposed to get from this. They pretty much all, they look the same, which is great, cool, awesome. Now, if we again look at stellar mass versus integrated velocities version and compare the gold stars, which are the galaxies at redshift 3, to other samples, but now at redshift 2, I hope you can see at the massive end that there's a bit of discrepancy. And in particular, the gold lies below these two bands here. These are other surveys. They're much larger because at redshift 2, once again, I'll get into that some other time. But you could argue, well, the blue one seems to be consistent, except the blue one only has points down here, so it's just an extrapolation to higher redshift, so I can almost throw that one out, versus up here where these are fairly well sampled. And so I think the main, hopefully you see that there is a difference between those at the high mass end. At the low mass end, there's a lot of scatter because it's hard to measure things at low mass, so they're all consistent nominally within the scatter. So moving forward, we're just going to break things into the really just focus